Okay, I'll make just several comments and then I'll ask Diane a few questions that gives us just a couple of minutes spare. I'm going to read a passage out of Genesis chapter 3 where God is judging after Adam and Eve have sinned. Adam is the originator of sin. Eve was tricked. I really do need to emphasize that. And you men need to stop blaming the woman for bringing sin into the world. Adam made that choice. Eve was fooled by a very clever and very brilliant serpent. And the word serpent is most probably meaning a colorful, beautiful looking, what we would call a dinosaur that had legs, and now the serpents don't. Okay, Genesis 3:15 and 16. God tells Eve, the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between her seed and your seed. He shall bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. Then in verse 16, God said something that most of us ignore. To the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In sorrow you'll bring forth children, and your desire will be to your husband, and he shall rule over thee. Now, there's an interesting implication of that. If you look up the word increase and you look up the word conception, they refer to the number of kids you will have. So don't be surprised that one of the consequences we see as you move from Eve to the flood, from the flood to the present, is the number of children that people are having and animals are having is increasing. I'm pretty sure that for the year of the flood, the animals that went on the ark did not multiply and fill the earth, and Noah and his wife and the three sons and their wives didn't get pregnant either. So you're looking at another factor involved in this, and that is God's overriding plan in conception and in multiplication and in lifespans, etc. So Diane, would you like to comment genetically, medically, because your background is that, on what brings rise to death anyway? I'll throw in one more comment. I have collected photographs, thousands of them, of tombstones all around the planet, from ancient Romans right the way up to people in the outback. I visited the grave of Mr. Brumby in Tasmania and recorded it all. And the one thing I've noticed is the common belief that we're living longer and living healthier is simply not true. We used to live, even though it might have only been a small percentage. I went to a valley in Scotland. We're up at the top where the Roman mine was, and still is a mine display today. The people lived 160, 170. By the time you get down to the Industrial Revolution, the average age, because the kids all died, many of them, when they were young, but mum and dad, if they survived, lived to their 80s and 90s. So we are not living longer. But Diane, what is it that causes us to die?
Well, we go back to the question about mutations. We get to the stage where we can't repair our bodies. Our bodies are being assaulted, as it were, by the external environment, and also our normal cellular processes do produce waste products which are going to damage our cells. But we have repair processes built in. But eventually, even the repair processes get knocked out by mutations. So eventually we get to the stage where we can't repair our body, and so we will die. And if you look at the biblical history in terms of those lifespans, remember Adam and Eve, Adam specifically, we're given his lifespan, it was 930. Now, ultimately, the reason we die is because God told Adam that it would be a punishment for sin. And Adam and Eve sinned, and God carried out his punishment. God always carries out his word. But death is actually a physical process. So something had to happen to their bodies, and it did start straight away. But remember, we said their bodies would have started out perfect, no mutations, nothing going wrong, until God basically let the processes of normal biology happen. And remember, as part of the punishment for Adam and Eve, they were forbidden to have access to the tree of life. And I just wonder whether the tree of life actually had a function of keeping those repair processes going. Because if the repair processes can keep up with the degenerative processes, right, you will stay healthy. But that is not what's happening now, and I suspect that that's what started to happen. But Adam was able to live to 930 because he started out with a perfect body with no mutations. These days, we start out with a whole lot of mutations which we have inherited, because there are mutations that affect just your own generation, just your own self, but sometimes there are mutations which will affect the ova and sperm, in other words, the cells that are going to form the next generation. And so we've all inherited a few mutations from our parents, who inherited some from their parents, and the number of mutations in the overall population is going up. So that's why time is no help to the theory of evolution. So we die ultimately because God gave the punishment for sin. Physically, we die because mutations are going on within our own lifespan because of assaults from the environment, chemicals, radiation, all of those things, plus the waste products from our own sort of biological functions and loss of repair processes. Now, a lot of people do ask, well, people in the Middle Age, the average ages were in the Middle Ages or the early Industrial Revolution, the average age span was sort of 30 to 40. Surely we're living longer. Well, this is where you need to look at the statistics in their context. Yes, if you just look at the average, it was that low. What's happened is that now people survive longer because we can deal with the things that used to kill people early in their life. And perhaps I can illustrate that with a graph that I've got. This is a series of graphs of what's called a survivorship, or the number of persons surviving to successive ages, or survivor graph. Now, what you're looking at here is if you start out with a cohort of people, in other words, a number of people who are all born within a certain time. So all the people who were born, say, in this case, 1851. But there are estimations of this that go further back. Now, if you take a cohort that are all born in the 1 year and then go through the successive decades, there will be a certain number of people who die in infancy. Now, in 1851, that was quite a lot because there were a lot of diseases that we can now treat. So now they've been a bit fanciful here in this graph. They're going up to 2031. I think they're having themselves on. But if you just compare, say, the first line there, 1851, with maybe 1971, so we've got a bit of data from that, what happens is in modern times, apart from certain birth defects and certain diseases, certain infectious diseases, most people survive those early years of infancy. Then they go into childhood and adolescence, and early adulthood are fairly disease-free periods these days. But back in 1851 or back in the Middle Ages, if you were injured or got some sort of infectious diseases, we couldn't treat those in those days, so you just died. So people tended to die earlier. But for those who survived war and pestilence and various other hazards of life, they did actually live to quite an old age. So there would still be a cohort left at 90 and 100, but it would be a lower percentage of the original cohort compared to what's happening now. Now, the people who made this graph are, I think, getting a bit fanciful in that they're expecting a lot of people to be living till 120, but it is possible. And I think John has got some interesting examples from history, from looking at actual gravestones where you do have dates for how long they were able to live.
A couple of comments, because there's some interesting comments on the chat on life and death, etc. We do need to remember a paper produced by the Russians when they were strong and atheistic. I saw it when I was studying genetics at Queensland University, and the comment was, we've looked at the body It's got all the repair mechanisms it needs. So why do we die? And they ended up concluding, after discussing, well, some of them don't really work and some of them are busted, etc. There is no reason why man should die if we could fix up all the mechanisms. Now, basically, Diane has said something similar, but we can add something the then atheistic Russian government wouldn't. The fact is, death is a penalty for disobedience. And Adam and Eve, right up to the flood, environment stays the same. So their mechanisms, which started out perfect, slightly degenerated by the time of the flood, still repaired their bodies for nearly 1,000 years. After the flood, rapid environmental change, the changes in the repair mechanisms got worse and worse and worse. Lifespan drops and drops and drops to the point where you get, say, in the last little ice age in England. I remember reading an Admiralty report when the wind all of a sudden changed, and instead of flowing north of England, it came from Russia right across the edge of France down into England, and thousands of sailors died in one day because they just froze to death on their ships, dressed as they were in those days. Now, no repair mechanism is going to deal with that. But you've got to remember, death is not just a physical phenomena, it's a spiritual penalty. And in reality, you've got the evidence in the gravestones about how long we used to live. So in that valley I was telling you about in Scotland, photographing gravestones all the way down the valley as we head towards the Industrial Revolution, where people move from the country into the city and work in the mines and the factories. What you discover is, well, one family had 12 kids. My dad comes from a Scottish family of 12 kids. But the family on the gravestone, 10 of them died before they were 7 or 8. Very common phenomena. So death was a constant reminder to them. And yet the 2 who lived, go down the valley a bit, they lived till nearly 100. So what you find is the lifespan wasn't affected greatly, but the average lifespan was, as Diane's graph actually says. And I noticed someone says, you're right, you can go and read the gravestones. Go and do it. York has got a whole lot of Roman gravestones in it, or coffins anyway. So go and have a look at some of these and see the ones that mention how long they lived, what killed them. So we've got data for thousands of years. We've even got it in the Bible about how long they lived, how many people there were, populations, etc. So today's subject is not something we're making up. It's something you can access across the whole of history. And there's one thing to finish with. Death is a penalty for sin, and there's no way out until the sin's penalty is paid. And that's why Jesus came, and he had to die. The wages of sin is death. That's the real reason we die. Not just getting cold on a British ship, not just running out of food in Alaska, not any of those things. They're all secondary. Death is an imposed penalty, and the good news that we all stand for is that you can have eternal life where you don't die again. And yes, you do have access to the tree of life in the new heavens and the earth, only if you accept that Christ has died in your place and you ask him to be your Lord and Savior.